So, I don't know how many of you are as crazy connected to the internet like I am, but apparently today is Roald Dahl Day or anniversary of something, which I learned because Facebook told me so. And a lot of people were posting quotes, pictures, images, and as a kid I enjoyed his books. The Big Friendly Giant, DFG was one of them, which is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Good books. So I found this quote online, and I really liked it because it has a lot to do with what I'm talking about today. So I wanted to read it real quick before we really begin, as the paper is getting passed out. If you are interested in something, no matter what it is, go at it at full speed ahead. Embrace it with both arms. Hug it, love it, and above all, become passionate about it. Lukewarm is no good. Hot is no good either. White hot and passionate is the only thing to be. And I like that, and we're going to talk more about kind of how that pertains to living a life of faith. But before we do anything, let's begin in prayer before we do anything more. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I would love for all of you to say this with me too. Dearest Lord, teach us to be generous. Teach us to serve you as you deserve. To give and not to count the cost. To fight and not to heed the wounds. To toil and not to seek for rest. To labor and not to ask for reward. Save that of knowing we are doing your will. Excellent, thank you. So as we get started, I asked the sycamore tree to come and have resources available because the reason why we're doing this is to just gain insight on how we can work towards living a life of faith. And if the only way we do that is coming to church meetings, then we're missing so many opportunities. So they brought a whole bunch of books and resources for you to take with you and take home and read and learn and grow on your own time, in your own place. And if you are interested in something that they don't have, they can order it for you. So please talk with Richard and Maria at any point, and there are a couple of things that I will highlight as I go through. So I want to share stories of a couple of different people, and then relate that a little bit to my life and stuff that I've learned, and ways that I have tried to improve myself, sometimes with success, sometimes not so much. And I want to start back in the early 20th century. In 1919, a millionaire in New York offered a reward of $25,000 for the first person who could successfully fly across the Atlantic Ocean between New York City and Paris. Now at the time, nobody even tried because it was the most ridiculous, outlandish contest anyone had ever proposed. There was no way it was feasible, it was just totally impossible. So it wasn't for almost 7 years that somebody actually finally attempted it. Around that time, there was a young college dropout named Charles Lindbergh who had taken up flying as a career. I don't know how much of you about Charles Lindbergh's life you actually know, if anything, but it's kind of fascinating learning more about him. He started his career as a barnstormer. So if you know what a barnstormer is, think Wright Brothers biplane, and think of doing that with flips and going upside down and going like 10 feet above the ground. And so he would do this, but he would be up on the wing. So there'd be a pilot who would be flying crazy like, and he would get out of the plane and climb up on the wing and attach himself, and they would do like loop-de-loops and barrel rolls and go down to the ground. And that's how he started his flying career, on the outside of the plane. Eventually he met a pilot who was really good, and Lindbergh asked to be his apprentice, and the guy was impressed by him, so he took him on as an apprentice, and Lindbergh learned about fixing planes and the inside of planes and what made them work and how to fly them. And he eventually got so good, even though he was a college dropout, he applied to the U.S. Army Air Force School and was enrolled. And he graduated the first in his class, and he was really well respected among the people in the aviation community. He eventually landed a job in St. Louis, which was vying for wanted to be one of the preeminent locations of aviation in the United States. They were really trying to get good pilots in to really promote their city as a place where flying was the best. So he was employed as the chief pilot for the airmail service flying out of St. Louis. And his route was St. Louis to Chicago. Now, when you think about airmail, you think you load some letters on a plane, no big deal. You fly them somewhere, you drop them off. Well, the mortality rate in 1921 of airmail pilots was 75%. So 3/4 of the pilots who were flying letters from one location to another did not make it. They were using old World War I planes. So planes that were 15 years old, that had seen combat potentially. They were not in the best condition. And people would get up in these things, and they were flying through weather conditions that were not safe for even good planes. And the planes were crashing and exploding and burning and all sorts of bad things. And Lindbergh said, I want to do that. And part of why he wanted to do that was because he was passionately invested in promoting aviation. People were wary of airplanes. It was still very new. You know, like when the new iPhone comes out, you're like, I don't know, I'll wait until they do a couple upgrades before I get that, work the bugs out. It's like that with airplanes, except people would die. So they tried to limit that by not getting in planes. So the same thing would happen if you write a letter to your Aunt Marge who lived in Chicago, and someone flew it there, and they crashed, and the plane burned. Well, there goes your letter to Aunt Marge. And now she's upset, and you're going to hear about it at Christmas. So Lindbergh actually made it a point to do whatever he could to get the letters there safely. No matter how many letters he was taking, sometimes if people were feeling good, there were a lot of letters, and sometimes there were only a few, but he still had to make that trip from St. Louis to Chicago. And there were times when the plane would malfunction, and he was so committed to getting the letters there safely that he would fly the plane longer and empty the fuel tanks before bailing out, so that when the plane crashed, it didn't explode and catch on fire and the letters could be recovered. So in his barnstorming days, he learned how to parachute, so he had no problem jumping out of the plane, but before he did so, he wanted to make sure that the letters were secure. So about this time that he was flying back and forth from St. Louis to Chicago, he read a newspaper article in 1926 of a group of 4 people who attempted to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't get very far. Their plane was so heavy from all the fuel that they would need to get across the ocean that on the runway trying to take off, they hit a bounce, went up, turned a little sideways, landed, flipped over, and the plane exploded. 2 of the people got out safely, the other 2 people did not. And this was huge news because it was the first time anyone had even tried this outlandish contest that this millionaire had proposed. And it failed miserably. And Lindbergh had never heard of it. 7 years old, and he had never heard of it. The contest, not Lindbergh. So he read this and he thought, I want to do that. And part of it was he wanted to be the one to do it, but the amazing thing about Lindbergh is that he actually really felt strongly about doing that so that people would feel excited about planes. People would feel invested in aviation, and people would rally their interest and their money around promoting flying and aviation. You know, a lot of times when someone gets into something like that, a world first, it's all about them and the vainglory, and I want to be the one, and I want the publicity. But Lindbergh was described as shy and modest and driven and determined. He was not a seeker of the spotlight. He was a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. So when he poured his energy into this, he was doing it more for the goal, to achieve recognition for flight and for advancing aviation. So he started studying how to go about this the right way, and he really focused all of his efforts on figuring out the best way to do it. And he was watching other people who were trying now to attempt this flight, and they were using planes with 3 engines, because at that time people thought, well, you need more power to get there. But in order to fuel 3 engines, you need 3 times the fuel, which made your plane 3 times heavier. And the reason that first attempt didn't get off the runway is because it was too heavy. So Lindbergh said, you know what? I'm going to build my plane with 1 engine, because 1 engine, fewer chances of something going wrong, less fuel I have to take, that's going to work better. And people thought he was nuts. You can't fly with 1 engine. It's not going to work. You're not going to have the power to get there. And then he said, well, I'm going to fly alone. So these people were doing 3, 4-man flights, 3 engines. So more people, more weight. More engines, more fuel, more weight. Lindbergh said, I'm going to do it alone, fewer people, less weight, do it with 1 engine, less fuel, less weight, and everyone thought he was nuts. They gave him the nickname the Flying Fool. So he didn't listen to any of that. He didn't listen to the criticism because he knew this is going to work. So he looked for backers who would help fund his dream of building a plane. And he found people in St. Louis where he was, because he was so well respected for the work that he'd done in the airmail, he basically found 16 people who put up $15,000. Again, in those days, that's a big chunk of money. And basically said, we will help you do this because we believe in you and we think you can do it. So then he went around looking for someone to build his plane. And everyone laughed at him and said, you can't do this with one engine, that's ridiculous. But he eventually found a guy in San Diego working out of this stinky old factory with a few other people who were really excited and believed in him as well and wanted to be part of this big adventure. And so Lindbergh designed a plane. He designed it specifically to maximize the amount of fuel the plane could hold and to minimize everything else. And real quick, I want to show you the flight path. So he calculated exactly how far it would be. And so from New York City, right in here, flying over Cape Cod and Newfoundland, all the way across, over Ireland and England into Paris, calculated 3,600 miles. So with 3,600 miles, he'd need a lot of fuel. And if he was going to carry that much fuel, he had to get rid of all the other weight. So anything superfluous, he had to cut. And he went about it so willfully that he removed everything that didn't need to be in the airplane. So I want to show you a picture of the plane and talk about it. So if you look at the picture, he did a bunch of things that people had never done before. One of the things he did is normally the engine was in front of the plane and the fuel, in front of the pilot, and the fuel was behind the pilot. And that would enable the pilot to have a clear view out in front. Well, Lindbergh had seen people crash and explode because they were trapped between their fuel tank behind them and their engine in front of them, both of which were flammable and explosive. And he said, if I crash on the runway, I'm going to have a better chance of getting out alive if I put everything in front of me. So he moved all the fuel tanks in front of him. He's got fuel tanks here, fuel tanks here, fuel tanks here, oil tanks here. And that meant he had no windshield. So he was designing a plane to fly across the Atlantic Ocean without being able to see in front of him. He had a window here and a window here. And people were like, I don't think you can do that. You can't see. And he said, well, I've got my compass, and if I need to, I can bank a little bit. But they eventually talked him into putting a periscope out the side, so if necessary, he could look through and see in front of him. But again, it was something that he didn't need a front windshield. He was going to fly 3,600 miles. He wanted to get there in a way that didn't require using anything superfluous or extra. Some of the other interesting things that he did, his plane did not have a radio on it. Radios were heavy. He didn't need that weight. He figured, if I crash, I'm going to die. If I get lost, I don't have enough fuel to get anywhere, I'm going to die. So why bother putting any kind of communication device? It's too heavy, I don't need it. He didn't have navigation instruments. There were a lot of electronics that you could put in your plane, but they were heavy. So he took a compass. That's what he used, compass and his map. He didn't have a parachute either. He figured, I'm not going to get high enough that it's going to be an issue. If I drop in the ocean, I don't need a parachute down there. So he left all those things. A lot of times in airplanes those days, you would build these heavy leather and metal seats for comfort, stability in the cockpit. He ditched that idea. He built a wicker chair that he would sit on. So light, it was made out of just, light wood. And that was it. He didn't need comfort. He actually needed to stay awake because he was going to be flying for a long time and comfort would be bad. He brought 5 sandwiches and a gallon of water. So he was at flight for about 33 and a half hours. He had 5 sandwiches and a gallon of water, and that was it. The craziest thing, and the thing that I first heard about that I remarked at was what he did with his maps. Can I borrow you guys for volunteers? All right, so this is my very well-drawn map of the North Atlantic here. Grab that side. So, I don't need to explain this to you because you can tell, but this is New York City. And this is Ireland and England, and that's Paris. So he had maps. And he took the maps and he said, well, I'm flying this route, so I don't need any of that, because this is too heavy. And then he said, I don't need this up here. because that's too heavy too. So this is what he took on his plane. He had a couple of different maps. Thank you, that was lovely. You can keep that. Show your friends. He cut the edges off some maps that he needed. He needed the full map, but he didn't need the margin. And that's how focused he was on making sure that his plane was as streamlined as possible. If it was superfluous, he didn't want it in there because it was just a distraction. It did not get him closer to his goal. And I think that's awesome. And going back to the goal, I like to think of when he first read that newspaper article in 1926 about the disaster of the first attempt, that he was the first person to come up with a bucket list goal. Are you guys familiar with the term bucket list? So in 2007, there was a movie with Jack Nicholson, Morgan Freeman. It was basically a list of things you want to do before you kick the bucket. So stuff you want to do in your life before you die. And so Lindbergh had this crazy bucket list idea. And so I want you to take your paper, and if you came in late, we have paper and pens for you. So I want you to take your paper, and I want you to draw a horizontal line across it in the middle of the page. And I want you to write bucket list on the bottom, below the line, like that. I use high-tech technology, folks. This overhead projector circa 1978. So hopefully your paper is going to look like that, and we're going to come back to it. And if you need to see it more, I'll show it more later. Complicated designs, I know. All right, so that's Lindbergh's plane. One last interesting statistic is that the plane was 27 feet long, so it's like, so it's about from here to the podium, that's how long the plane was, 27 feet. But the wingspan was 46 feet wide. So the plane's wings were a lot wider than the plane was long. When it was empty, the plane weighed 1 ton. The fuel that it had to transport with it alone weighed 1.5 tons. So a plane had to transport more than its weight in fuel. So the design had to be strong enough of a plane, but light enough. The other interesting thing is all of his competitors who were trying to achieve the same goal with their 3-engine planes, they weighed 8 times the amount of Lindbergh's plane. And that was the big problem. The big problem was things were too heavy. And that's why people were crashing. But they still thought he was crazy, even though he was building it lighter. So while Lindbergh was finishing the plane in San Diego, there were actually 4 other groups of aviators who were ready to fly. And Lindbergh knew this and was kind of freaking out a little bit because the goal was about to be, someone else was about to achieve the goal, and he hadn't been able to start yet. But interestingly enough, so these 4 teams, the first attempt, they were doing a test flight, routine test flight before takeoff, the actual attempt. And the test flight crashed, so they had to go back and repair the plane. The second attempt crashed at the end of the runway when they were actually trying. The third group is actually in Virginia. There was a group of 2 guys who were flying a test flight in Virginia and crashed, and they both died. And then the final team, there was a French team that decided all these people who are trying to fly out of New York are failing and dying, so forget that. We're flying from Paris instead. And so they decided to leave from Paris, and this was about 2 days before Lindbergh finished. So they leave from Paris, and they get up, they take off, and they're going. And then there was even reports that they were spotted over Newfoundland, meaning they'd made it all the way across the Atlantic. But then no one heard from them again. Between Newfoundland and New York, there's a stretch of ocean, I guess between Newfoundland and Cape Cod. So they were never seen from again, never heard from again. And later, it was deemed that the sighting over Newfoundland was not actually viable. So they took off from Paris and were never heard from or seen from again, which is sad, except that it meant that Lindbergh was still in the race. So his plane is finished in San Diego, but he's got to get to New York City to take off. So he flies, he wants to fly back, but he wants to fly through St. Louis because the people in St. Louis funded his plane and basically helped him get to where he could live his dream. That's why he called the plane the Spirit of St. Louis. So he flies from San Diego to St. Louis in his awesome new, speedy, light plane, and he breaks the world speed record. He flies all night at over 100 miles an hour, and no one has ever achieved a speed like this. He didn't need to fill the plane totally up because he's just going to St. Louis. But he breaks the record, the world speed record. He says hi to all his folks, and then he goes from St. Louis to New York City then, like, later that day. And then, in doing so, he flew from one coast to the other and broke the record for how long it took someone to fly from the West Coast to the East Coast. So the plane is doing well so far. So they fuel it up, and now it's at like super heavy weight. And he goes and he takes off. It's the morning, it's 7:52 a.m. on Friday, May 20th, 1927. And I've seen video footage of the takeoff, and it is the scariest thing ever because it's like rumbling down this field and bouncing around, and it tries to get up and bounces down, and tries to get up and bounces down, and finally it takes off. And there are telephone poles at the end of the runway, and it misses them by about 20 feet as it's flying off. And that's it. That's the last time people can talk to him because he's got no radio. And so he leaves, and he follows this path. He's fighting sleep the whole time. It turns out he stayed up the whole night before he went because he was so nervous. So not only was he going for 33 and a half straight hours, but he didn't sleep the night before. And so there was a time, I think in here, where it's nighttime and he was struggling to stay awake. And he had to really just reach down inside of himself. You know, it's like if I fall asleep, I'm going to die. I have a goal that I want to achieve, but more importantly, like, I want to live. I want to do this. So he had to find all sorts of resources within him and pull to make it through. And he did. He eventually did, obviously. He landed after 33 hours, so the next day it was 10:22 Paris time, so at night. And he landed in a field, and 140,000 people mobbed to see him because he'd been spotted over Ireland, and people communicated that, and he was spotted over England. And it was very exciting, biggest news in the world. And what I think, kind of like what I take from all of this, is how focused he was on achieving his goal. He didn't care that people thought he was insane for flying a single-engine plane by himself. He didn't care about the people who were saying, you can't do this, it's impossible. He didn't care about all that. He saw his goal, he figured out the way to do it, and he cut out all the distractions and anything superfluous from his life. And that's one of the things I want to come back to, cutting out the distractions and things that are superfluous. And I found his determination and his focus to be very inspiring. And also his modesty. When he got out and they wanted him to do speeches everywhere, he would do like 30-word speeches. And it wasn't about him. It wasn't about the spotlight for him. It was about promoting aviation. And I think that was awesome. So from here, I want to transition to another guy. Anyone know who this is? It is a bird.
It looks like
Oh, yes! 10,000 bonus points. So this is St. Ignatius of Loyola. For those of you who don't know much about St. Ignatius of Loyola, he is 16th century. He grew up as a military general. He became a military general, and he was seeking a life of military greatness. When on a battlefield, he got hit by a cannonball in the legs, and it injured one leg and shattered the other. And his military career was ruined. And he was convalescing in a hospital for a very long period because back then it took a long time to recover from shattered cannonball wounds. Probably does now too, but... so all the hospitals back then were run by nuns. And the reading material that was available to him were spiritual readings. And he ended up getting a hold of spiritual books and reading Lives of the Saints and reading Life of Spirituality, and found that all this determination that he had to succeed in his military career, which was now no longer possible, he shifted it over and started saying, I could do this, I could be a saint. And he started finding that he would take all of his military cunning and prowess and started then applying it to living a life of holiness and pursuing holiness. And for those of you who are familiar with sort of his St. Ignatius background and what he's produced, one of the famous books of his, The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. It's a 30-day silent retreat. He actually has a book that he wrote about it. It's a very cerebral, heady book. There is a copy of it over on that table. This is not to be approached lightly. If you're looking for a nice casual read, this is not your book. But if you're really looking for something to dive into like deep personal reflection and spiritual growth, check it out. So the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius are 30-day silent retreat. And I used to attend versions of these that were much shorter. They were like the 4-day version. And I remember hating them intensely because it was so quiet. Believe it or not, silent retreats are very quiet. And it was like a decade later, I did this personality inventory where it relates to your spirituality style. And I'm an ENFP on the Myers-Briggs, and it's like, you might like the Franciscan prayer style. The worst one is the Ignatian spiritual exercises retreat. It's like, this explains so much. These retreats were terrible, but there were great things that came out of it. In the silence, we are able to dive deeper and to, like Lindbergh, put aside the distractions and focus on what we need to focus on. But what I want to touch on with the retreat experience is that getting away from our lives and the busyness and the hecticness of everyday life is very important. It's something that we don't often make time for. In youth ministry, retreats are one of the most important things we do, where afterwards you can see people are changed because we get out of the stress, we get out of the frustrations and difficulties, and we just go away and we focus on our faith. But as adults, we don't really get that opportunity much. And so I want to encourage us, all of us, to think about going on a retreat sometime. If you're a man and you have not been on a Curcio retreat, there's a weekend coming up in mid-October, and I would highly recommend it. There's also other opportunities for retreats. The Diocese of Richmond has a men's conference and a women's conference coming up. I think the women's is in November and the men's is in January. I have posters on the Christian Information Bulletin board in the hallway. But something where we get out of our daily stress and we just go away and have time apart to focus on our relationship with God. It's so important. And oftentimes we don't make time for it because there's so many other things that we think are more important. So I would highly recommend a retreat experience. So Ignatius has his background as a military person, and a lot of what he talks about is very militaristic. It's very, like, he approaches things tactically. You know, like, in order to succeed here, I have to maneuver my troops, and like, you can kind of see this theme throughout stuff that he does. And on these retreats, I remember thinking sort of about this and his focus on, like, the enemy. The person he's battling against is the devil and the evil one. There's a verse in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 to 9. Your opponent, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, steadfast in your faith, knowing that your fellow believers throughout the world undergo the same sufferings. And I like this passage because, especially the second part, resist him, steadfast in your faith, knowing that your fellow believers throughout the world undergo the same sufferings. You know, as a military person, he knew that he couldn't win a battle without his army. You know, he needed his men surrounding him. And so you go on retreat, and you meet communities of people who build you up and support you in your times of need. And then you come home from those retreats, and hopefully you get involved in a small group. You know, if you get involved in Curcio, the retreat, then there's Curcio small groups that meet weekly afterwards. And just a great experience for each week coming together with people to talk about your faith and your life and really grow deeper and lift each other up and celebrate with each other. That community is very important because we can't conquer the things we need to conquer without people by our side. The other part is accountability. Actually, before I say that, there is a great book by C.S. Lewis. Has anyone here ever read the Screwtape Letters?
Yes.
So the Screwtape Letters is a much easier to read book than the Spiritual Exercises. What the Screwtape Letters is, it's written from the viewpoint of a demon who is writing to his nephew, and his nephew, another demon, has the task of trying to ruin the soul of a human being. And so the uncle is giving advice to the new demon, like, hey, here's how you ruin a soul. And they're short little bursts. It's a fun, easy read. Do you have a copy of that?
Yes.
So there's a copy of that here too. This is an easy one too. This is not like the Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. But it's interesting to see how the uncle is like steering the nephew away, like, oh, watch out for those Christians. They'll make it a lot harder to ruin a soul. Oh no, not accountability. You'll make it a lot harder to ruin a soul if someone's trying to help them through. And I just found that book really interesting. It's short, it's easy, so I would recommend that one as well. So the importance of a community and accountability. There's a passage from Romans chapter 7, verses 15 and 19. What I do not understand. For I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate. For I do not do the good I want, but I do the evil I do not want. Have you ever been in a situation in life where you find yourself thinking, I shouldn't do this. This is really dumb, but I'm going to do it anyways. Or, I should really do that good thing. It'd be a lot nicer. But I'm not gonna, because I'm lazy, or tired, or there's something on Netflix. Whatever, So the importance of having someone to hold you accountable, whether it's a small group or a close friend, to keep you accountable. And so when you're feeling like, man, I know what I need to do, but I don't have the strength, that's when you call your person up. And you say, all right, I need a kick in the butt. Swift, hard, kick in the butt, maybe a slap in the face too. Small groups are great for that. Accountability partners are great for that. When I was in college, I was active in campus ministry there, and we had a great small group. And I remember talking to a friend of mine before a break, where we were about to all go home. And he was sharing with me that he was struggling with pornography. And when he was at school, it was much easier to overcome the struggle because we were all there in community. We met with a small group, we had campus ministry activities, there were so many things keeping him full spiritually that he was never really tempted. But when he went home, he didn't have that support system. He was by himself, he felt alone, and he had this stash that he just couldn't bring himself to get rid of. And he would eventually give in to the temptation. And we're sitting here talking at UVA in Charlottesville, and I was like, you know what? Let's go right now. Let's go drive to your house, and I'll throw it away. It's easy for me to fix your problem. It's not my struggle. I'll get your stash. So he could tell I was serious, and it was midnight, and he lived in Danville. So at midnight, we got in the car, and we drove 2.5 hours south to Danville, and we snuck into his parents' house. And I remember thinking, I really hope we don't get caught. How do you explain this? It's cool, we're not here for your valuables, just your pornography. Go back to bed, no worries. So we snuck in, went up to his room, showed me where the stash was, I grabbed it, went outside. No parents woke up, that was good. The dog didn't wake up, that was good. We drove to a dumpster at some random store, and I chucked it in, and we drove back to Charlottesville. We got back at 5:30 a.m., and it was exhausting, but it was worth it. I was able to support my